The October sun was setting behind the red sandstone cliffs when Ezra Whitman found the body. He'd been tracking his missing cattle through the narrow canyon when he spotted the dark shape lying motionless among the sagebrush, partially hidden by a boulder the size of a wagon. At first glance, he thought it might be a deer or perhaps one of his steers, but as he dismounted his horse and walked closer, his weathered hands trembling slightly, he realized it was a young woman. Apache by her clothing and dark braided hair, she lay face down in the red dirt, her traditional dress torn and stained with what looked like dried blood. Ezra knelt beside her, his knees creaking with the effort. At 55, he moved like a man much older, worn down by 3 years of solitude on his failing ranch. His wife Sarah had died of pneumonia, his son had left for California seeking gold, and the town of Red Canyon had gradually forgotten he existed. But this woman, she was someone's daughter, someone's hope. He couldn't just leave her here for the coyotes. "Hello?" he called softly. Though he could see she wasn't moving, no response came from the still form. Carefully, he reached out to touch her shoulder, checking for any sign of life. That's when he heard the horses approaching. Sheriff Marcus Webb rode into the canyon with 3 of his deputies, their badges gleaming in the fading light. Webb was a big man with a carefully trimmed mustache and the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned. Behind him rode Tom Fletcher, his right-hand man, and 2 newer deputies whose names Ezra never bothered to learn. "Ezra Whitman," Webb called out, his voice carrying the authority of 10 years wearing a badge. "Step away from the body." "She might still be alive," Ezra said, not moving. "We should get Doc Morrison." "She's been dead since morning," Webb interrupted, dismounting with practiced ease. "We've been tracking the Apache who killed her. Dangerous bunch, probably heading back to the reservation." Ezra frowned. Something in the sheriff's tone didn't sit right. "How do you know she's been dead since morning?" "I just found her." Webb's hand moved to rest on his gun belt, a gesture that might have looked casual to anyone who didn't know him, but Ezra had seen that move before. It was Webb's way of reminding people who was in charge. "We got reports of Apache raiders in the area," Webb said smoothly. "This poor girl probably tried to escape and got caught in the crossfire. Tragic, but that's what happens when savages get restless." Fletcher nodded along, but the 2 younger deputies looked uncomfortable. One of them, a kid named Billy Santos, kept glancing between the woman's body and the sheriff's face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Don't seem right." "Leaving her here?" Ezra said quietly. "We'll handle it proper," Webb assured him. "But first we need to preserve the scene. Don't touch anything, don't move her. Could be evidence." Ezra studied the sheriff's face in the gathering dusk. Webb's eyes were steady, but there was something else there. Something that looked almost like relief when he'd seen Ezra standing over the body instead of kneeling beside it. "You boys been tracking these raiders long?" Ezra asked. "Long enough," Fletcher answered before Webb could respond. "Picked up their trail this morning near Devil's Backbone Ridge. They've been moving fast, staying to the high country, but Ezra knew those mountains better than any man alive, and he'd been up at Devil's Backbone just 2 days ago looking for strays. No sign of any Apache then, and the ground had been soft from recent rain. Fresh tracks would have been easy to spot. Strange they'd come this far down into the valley, Ezra observed. Apache usually stick to higher ground when they're moving through." Webb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Maybe they were desperate. Running low on supplies, needed water. "Plenty of water up high this time of year," Ezra said. "Spring's been running strong since the summer storms." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. Billy Santos shifted nervously in his saddle, and even Fletcher seemed to be avoiding eye contact with anyone. "Point is," Webb said finally, "this is official business now. We appreciate you finding her, Ezra, but we'll take it from here." Ezra looked down at the young woman again. Her face was turned away from him, pressed against the earth, but something about her position seemed wrong. She was lying too neatly, too deliberately, like someone had arranged her rather than letting her fall naturally. "Sheriff," Billy Santos spoke up hesitantly, "shouldn't we at least check if she's dead, boy," Webb snapped. "Been dead for hours. No point disturbing her now." But as Webb spoke, Ezra could have sworn he saw the woman's fingers twitch slightly, just barely enough to notice. He blinked, staring harder, but her hand was perfectly still now. "Don't turn the body over," Webb ordered, his voice carrying new authority. "We'll get the undertaker out here tomorrow to collect her properly. No need to disturb a crime scene." Ezra's instincts were screaming at him now. In his years ranching this harsh country, he'd developed a keen sense for when something was off. Animals acted strange before storms. Cattle got restless before predators appeared, and right now, everything about this situation felt like the moments before lightning struck. The young woman's clothing, while torn and dirty, didn't look like it had been damaged by violence. The blood staining her dress looked more like red clay mixed with water. And most importantly, Webb seemed awfully eager to keep anyone from taking a closer look. "I'll be heading back to town now," Webb announced.
"Fletcher, you and the boys set up a perimeter.
"Make sure nobody else wanders through here tonight." As the sheriff prepared to mount his horse, Ezra made a decision that would change everything. "Wait," he said. Webb turned, eyebrow raised. "Something else, Ezra? Just seems wrong. Leaving a young woman lying face down in the dirt. Dead or not, she deserves some dignity." Before anyone could stop him, Ezra reached down and gently turned the woman's body over. What he saw made him freeze completely. The woman's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, dark, frightened, but very much alive. She looked directly at him, a silent plea for help filling her gaze, before quickly closing her eyes again and going limp. But that wasn't what made Ezra's blood run cold. Clutched tightly in her right hand was a silver badge. Not just any badge, but one with a distinctive scratch across the star that Ezra recognized instantly. It was the badge that had belonged to Deputy Jim Crawford, who had supposedly died in a shootout with cattle rustlers 3 months ago. The badge that should have been buried with him. Ezra's hands began to shake as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't a random Apache woman killed by raiders. This was a witness to murder, and she had the evidence to prove it. Sheriff Webb's face had gone pale in the moonlight, and his hand was now fully resting on his gun. "Well, Ezra," Webb said quietly, "looks like you've gone and complicated things considerably." The canyon fell into deadly silence. Ezra kept his eyes fixed on the young woman's face, trying not to let his expression betray what he'd seen. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her body completely still except for the almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest. The badge remained clutched in her hand, partially hidden by her fingers but unmistakably there. "She's alive," Ezra said quietly. Sheriff Webb's hand tightened on his gun. "No, she's not. I can see her breathing. Sometimes bodies do that after death," Fletcher said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "Muscle spasms. Nothing unusual about it." Billy Santos had moved his horse closer, trying to get a better look. "Sheriff, if she's alive, shouldn't we—" "She's dead," Webb repeated firmly. "And you'd do well to remember that, boy." The threat in his voice was unmistakable now. Ezra had known Marcus Webb for 15 years, had even voted for him in the last election. But this wasn't the man who'd campaigned on law and order. This was someone else entirely, someone desperate and dangerous. "What's in her hand?" Ezra asked, though he already knew the answer. Webb's face hardened. "Nothing that concerns you. Looks like metal. Silver, maybe?" Ezra kept his voice level, conversational. "Might be important evidence if you're investigating her death." "I said it doesn't concern you." But Billy Santos had dismounted now and was approaching the woman's body. "Sheriff, I think Mr. Whitman's right. There's definitely something." "Get back on your horse, Santos," Webb barked. "That's an order." The young deputy hesitated, looking between his boss and the woman on the ground. "Sir, if she's got evidence, shouldn't we—" "What she's got is nothing," Fletcher interrupted. "Probably just grabbed some rocks when she fell." But Ezra could see the sweat beading on Fletcher's forehead despite the cool evening air. Whatever was in the woman's hand, both Webb and Fletcher knew exactly what it was. "Help me get her to my wagon," Ezra said, making another decision that surprised even himself. If she's alive, she needs a doctor. If she's dead, she still deserves better than lying in the dirt. "She's not going anywhere," Webb said, and now his gun was halfway out of its holster. Ezra looked up at the sheriff, seeing clearly for the first time the man behind the badge. Webb's eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd already decided to kill if necessary. "Marcus," Ezra said softly, using the sheriff's first name deliberately. "We've known each other a long time. Whatever's going on here, there's got to be a better way." "The only way is for you to get back on your horse and ride home," Webb replied. "Forget you were ever here. Forget what you think you saw. And if I don't?" Webb spun toward her, his gun tracking her movement, but Ezra was already moving. He dove forward. tackling the sheriff around the waist and sending them both crashing to the ground. The gun fired into the air, the shot echoing off the canyon walls. "Ride," Ezra yelled to the woman as he struggled with Webb. "Get to town. Find Judge Morrison." But even as he fought, Ezra knew they were both probably going to die in this canyon. Webb was younger, stronger, and Fletcher was already drawing his own weapon. The Apache woman hesitated for just a moment, looking at Ezra with something like gratitude, before sprinting toward the horses with surprising speed. Fletcher's gun boomed, but she was already diving behind the boulder where Ezra had first found her. "Kill them both." Webb gasped as he tried to get his weapon pointed at Ezra again. But Billy Santos, still holding Crawford's badge, made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He drew his own gun and pointed it at his sheriff. "Nobody else dies tonight," he said, his young voice shaking but determined. The standoff stretched across the canyon like a taut wire ready to snap. Billy Santos held his gun steady on Sheriff Webb, his hands trembling but his resolve clear. Fletcher's weapon was aimed at the boulder where the Apache woman had taken cover. Webb himself was still tangled with Ezra on the ground, both men breathing hard from their struggle. "Put your gun down, boy," Webb said to Santos, his voice dangerously calm. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." "Maybe so," Billy replied, "but I won't be part of murder." Ezra managed to roll away from Webb and get to his feet. Though the sheriff's gun was still in his hand, he looked toward the boulder trying to spot any sign of the woman. "What's your name?" he called out to her. "Ayanna," came the reply from behind the stone. "Ayanna Crowfeather." "How long have you been watching us?" Webb demanded, finally standing and brushing dirt from his coat. "Long enough." Her voice was steady despite the danger. "Long enough to see you loading stolen cattle. Long enough to see you kill Deputy Crawford when he tried to stop you." Fletcher stepped forward. "She's lying. Crawford died fighting rustlers just like we reported. Then why does she have his badge?" Billy Santos held up the silver star, the distinctive scratch clearly visible in the moonlight. This was supposed to be buried with him. Webb's face had gone hard as stone. Fletcher took it as a keepsake. "Nothing unusual about that." "Except Crawford was wearing it when you shot him," Ayanna called out. "I saw Fletcher take it from his body. Saw him throw the body in Devil's Canyon where the water would carry it away. The pieces were falling into place for Ezra. That's why there was no body to bury. You told the town Crawford's remains were too badly damaged to recover." "People believed what they needed to believe," Webb said. "Crawford was a hero who died in the line of duty. His widow got a pension. Everyone was satisfied." "Everyone except Jim Crawford," Billy said quietly. Fletcher was growing agitated, his gun wavering between the boulder and the young deputy. "Boss, we need to finish this. Dawn's coming, and someone might come looking." But Webb was studying the situation with the cold calculation that had kept him sheriff for a decade. "Actually, I think we can still salvage this." "Billy, you're young. You made a mistake tonight. Got confused in a dangerous situation. No one would blame you for that." "I'm not confused about what I heard. What you heard was a desperate woman making up stories to save her own life." Webb's voice took on the persuasive tone he used during election campaigns. "She's facing charges for cattle theft, maybe accessory to murder. Of course she'd try to blame law enforcement." Ezra saw the doubt creeping into Billy's young face. Webb was good at this, twisting truth until it looked like lies, making wrong sound reasonable. "Show him the cattle," Ayanna called out. "The ones in Fletcher's private cars at the rail yard. Cattle with reservation brands that you reported stolen." Fletcher's face went white. "How does she know about—" "Because she's been watching us for weeks," Webb finished grimly. "Haven't you, Ayanna?" There was no answer from behind the boulder. When Ezra looked carefully, he could see why. She was gone. While they'd been talking, she'd somehow slipped away into the maze of rocks and shadows that filled the canyon. "Where is she?" Fletcher demanded, spinning around. "Doesn't matter," Webb said. "She's Apache. No one in town will believe her word over ours." But Billy Santos was studying Crawford's badge, turning it over in his hands. "This scratch here, I remember it. Crawford was always running his thumb over it when he was thinking. So if Fletcher took it as a keepsake after Crawford was buried, why is there dried blood on it?" Billy held the badge closer to the moonlight. Fresh blood, like it was taken from someone who'd just been shot. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. Someone was riding hard toward their position. "Company coming." Fletcher said, raising his rifle. But the rider who emerged from the shadows wasn't Ayanna. It was Doc Morrison, the town's physician and coroner, riding his old mare like he was 20 years younger. "Heard gunshots?" Morrison called out as he approached. "Anyone hurt?" Webb quickly holstered his weapon, falling back into his sheriff persona. "Just some trouble with Apache raiders, Doc. Nothing we can't handle." Morrison dismounted and looked around the canyon, his trained eye taking in details. At 73, he'd seen enough violence to recognize its aftermath. "Where's the patient?" "No patient," Fletcher said quickly. "False alarm." But Morrison had already spotted the disturbed ground where Ezra and Webb had fought, the scattered rocks where Ayanna had been lying. "Someone was definitely here. I can see blood in the dirt." "Like I said, Apache raiders," Webb repeated. "They've moved on." Morrison knelt and touched the stained earth, bringing his fingers to his nose. "This isn't blood. It's red clay mixed with something else, probably water." He stood and fixed Webb with a steady look. "Want to tell me what's really going on here, Marcus?" Before Webb could answer, Billy Santos stepped forward. "Doc, I think we need your professional opinion on something." He held out Crawford's badge. Morrison took it carefully, examining it in the moonlight. "This is Jim's badge. Why isn't it buried with him?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Billy said, ignoring Webb's dangerous glare. Morrison studied the badge more closely, paying particular attention to the dark stains. "Marcus, this looks like fresh blood. How do you explain that?" Webb's hand drifted back toward his gun, but Morrison was watching him now with the sharp attention of a man who'd served as coroner for too many suspicious deaths. "I think," Morrison said slowly, "that we all need to ride back to town and have a long conversation with Judge Parker. Right now." "Now hold on, Doc," Fletcher started. "No," Morrison interrupted. "I don't know what's been happening out here tonight, but I know the smell of fear when I encounter it. And right now, everyone in this canyon smells terrified." He remounted his horse and looked down at the group. "We're all riding back together. Anyone who objects can explain their reasoning to the judge." As they prepared to leave the canyon, Ezra caught sight of a figure watching from the high rocks. Ayanna, safe for now, but still in danger as long as Webb and Fletcher remained free. The ride back to town was going to be very interesting indeed. The group rode through Red Canyon Township just as the church bells struck midnight. The main street was empty except for a few horses tied outside Murphy's saloon, where light spilled from the windows along with the sound of piano music and drunken laughter. Judge Parker lived in a 2-story house behind the courthouse, but Doc Morrison led them directly to the jail instead. "Wake up, Hiram," he called to the night deputy sleeping in a chair on the front porch. Hiram Murphy, the saloon owner's younger brother, jerked awake and nearly fell from his chair. "Doc, Sheriff? What's all this about?" "We need to see Judge Parker immediately," Morrison said. "Official business. Judge is probably asleep. Then wake him up." Morrison's tone brooked no argument. "This can't wait until morning." As Hiram hurried off toward the judge's house, Morrison turned to face the group. In the light from the jail's oil lamps, Ezra could see that the old doctor's face was grave with concern. "Before Parker gets here, I want to hear the truth," Morrison said. "All of it." Webb straightened his shirt and put on his most official expression. "Doc, I appreciate your concern, but this is a law enforcement matter. We were tracking Apache raiders when Ezra here interfered with our investigation." "By doing what?" "By disturbing a crime scene. Moving evidence." Morrison looked at Ezra. "What evidence?" Before Ezra could answer, Billy Santos stepped forward, still holding Crawford's badge. "Doc, I think Sheriff Webb and Deputy Fletcher have been lying about how Jim Crawford died. That's a serious accusation, son." "I know, sir. But this badge has fresh blood on it, and there was a woman, an Apache woman, who says she saw them kill Crawford." Webb's face flushed with anger. The word of a savage against sworn law enforcement. "Doc, surely you don't—" "I don't make judgments based on race, Marcus," Morrison said coldly. "I make them based on evidence. Where is this woman now?" "She ran," Fletcher said quickly. Probably halfway back to the reservation by now. But Ezra had been watching the shadows around the jail, and he'd caught sight of a familiar figure moving carefully between buildings. Ayanna hadn't run far. She was still here, still watching, still carrying whatever other evidence she might have gathered. Judge Parker arrived wearing a hastily donned coat over his nightclothes, his white hair uncombed and his expression thunderous. "This better be important, Morrison." "Murder usually is," the doctor replied. Parker's demeanor changed instantly. "Who's been murdered?" "Possibly Deputy Crawford," Billy Santos said, holding up the badge. "And maybe others." Parker studied the young man's face, then looked at each of the others in turn. "Let's go inside." "Hiram, light the lamps in my chambers." They filed into the small courtroom behind the jail, where Parker took his place behind the bench while the others arranged themselves on the wooden chairs normally reserved for witnesses and jury members. "Now then," Parker began, "I want to hear from each of you, starting with Deputy Santos." Billy took a deep breath and began his story, starting with finding Ayanna's body and ending with the revelation about the blood on Crawford's badge. His voice shook at times, but he left nothing out. When he finished, Parker turned to Webb. "Sheriff?" Webb launched into his prepared version. Apache raiders, cattle theft, a desperate woman making false accusations to save herself. His story was smooth, professional, the kind of report he'd given countless times before. But Parker was studying Crawford's badge while Webb spoke, turning it over in his weathered hands. "Marcus, when exactly did Fletcher take this badge from Crawford's body?" "Right after he died," Fletcher answered before Webb could respond. "Thought his widow might want it as a keepsake, but she never received it?" Fletcher hesitated. We decided it might be too painful for her." Parker nodded slowly. "Doc, you examined Crawford's burial site, didn't you?" "There was no burial site," Morrison said. "I was told the body was too damaged to recover. We held a memorial service with an empty coffin." "And you accepted that?" Morrison looked uncomfortable. It seemed plausible at the time. The story was that Crawford had been shot, and his body had fallen into a fast-moving creek. By the time backup arrived, there was no trace of him. "Except his badge somehow survived," Parker observed. "Interesting." Webb was starting to sweat despite the cool night air. "Judge, with all due respect, we're wasting time on the fantasies of a desperate woman while real criminals are escaping justice." "What criminals would those be?" "The Apache raiders who've been stealing cattle and terrorizing honest ranchers." Parker leaned back in his chair. "Ezra, you've been ranching in this area for 20 years. Have you had problems with Apache raiders?" "No, sir. Most of the Apache around here are peaceful. They stick to the reservation, mind their own business. Yet Sheriff Webb has filed 17 separate reports of Apache raids in the past 6 months. Parker pulled a stack of papers from his desk drawer. 17 reports of missing cattle, destroyed property, and general mayhem, all attributed to Apache raiders. Ezra felt his stomach tighten. 17 reports? And in every case, the damage just happened to occur on land adjacent to the railroad right-of-way. Land perfect for loading cattle onto train cars. Fletcher had gone completely pale now. "Judge, you can't possibly believe—" "What I believe," Parker interrupted, "is that we need to examine those train cars at the rail yard." "Right now," Webb stood abruptly. "Judge, it's the middle of the night. Surely this can wait. Murder doesn't wait for business hours, Sheriff." Parker reached for his coat. "Hiram, saddle my horse. We're taking a ride to the railroad." As the group prepared to leave the courthouse, Ezra caught sight of Ayanna again, this time much closer to the building. She was crouched behind a water trough, watching the proceedings through a window. He made a decision that felt both dangerous and necessary. "Judge," he said, "there's someone else who needs to be part of this investigation." "Oh?" "The Apache woman. She's here in town. She's the key witness to what really happened to Jim Crawford." Webb's hand went to his gun, but Parker was already moving toward the door. "Then let's go talk to her." Ayanna emerged from behind the water trough like a shadow becoming solid. In the lamplight from the courthouse, Ezra could see she was younger than he'd first thought, probably no more than 22, but her dark eyes held the wariness of someone who'd seen too much death. "You came back," she said to Ezra, her English careful but clear. "Couldn't leave you to face this alone," he replied. Judge Parker stepped forward, his expression grave but not unkind. "Miss, I'm Judge Parker. I understand you have information about Deputy Crawford's death." Ayanna nodded, but her gaze never left Sheriff Webb and Fletcher, both of whom had their hands near their weapons. "They killed him. Shot him when he tried to stop them from stealing cattle." "That's a lie," Webb said firmly. "Crawford died fighting raiders." "Then explain this," Ayanna said, reaching into a pouch at her waist. She pulled out a piece of paper, folded and stained but still readable. Deputy Crawford gave this to me before they shot him. Judge Parker took the paper and unfolded it carefully. Even in the dim light, Ezra could see it was some kind of official document. "It's a bill of sale," Parker read aloud. "For 50 head of cattle, sold to the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company. Signed by," he looked up sharply, "signed by Deputy Fletcher and witnessed by Sheriff Webb." Fletcher stepped back as if he'd been struck. "That's not possible. I never signed any—" "The cattle described here are branded with reservation marks," Parker continued reading. "Cattle that supposedly belonged to Apache raiders who stole them from local ranchers." "Crawford was investigating the cattle thefts," Ayanna said. "He discovered that the stolen cattle were being sold directly to the railroad, not recovered for the original owners." Doc Morrison whistled low. "That's a federal crime. Selling government property. It gets worse," Ayanna continued. "Show them what else I have." She reached into her pouch again and produced a small leather journal. Crawford kept records. Names, dates, amounts of money. 3 months of evidence. Parker opened the journal and began reading by lamplight. With each page, his expression grew darker. "According to this, you've been running stolen cattle through the railroad yard twice a week for the past 3 months. Total value," he paused to calculate, "over $8,000. Webb's face had gone ashen. $8,000 was more money than most men in Red Canyon Township would see in their entire lives. "Where did Crawford get this information?" Parker asked. "From me," Ayanna admitted. "My brother works loading cattle at the rail yard. He noticed that the same brands kept appearing. Reservation brands on cattle that were supposed to belong to local ranchers reporting thefts. So Crawford wasn't working alone." Ezra realized. "No, my brother came to me. I went to Crawford. He was the only lawman we trusted to investigate without warning the sheriff." Ayanna's voice grew quiet. "We were wrong about that." Billy Santos had been studying the journal over Parker's shoulder. "Judge, look at this entry from 2 weeks ago. It says Fletcher threatened to kill anyone who interfered with the operation. Crawford wrote that Fletcher told him the operation was sanctioned by the sheriff's office." Parker read. "That anyone who reported it would be charged with interfering with a law enforcement investigation." Fletcher finally found his voice. "That journal could have been written by anyone. You can't prove Crawford, actually." "Actually, I can," Doc Morrison interrupted. "I treated Crawford for a broken finger last month. He had a very distinctive way of holding a pen, compensated for the injury by gripping it differently. The handwriting in this journal shows the same compensation. The net was closing around Webb and Fletcher, but Ezra knew desperate men could still be dangerous. He noticed both lawmen had positioned themselves near their horses close to their rifles." "Judge," Ayanna said, "there's more. They didn't just kill Crawford. They've been planning to blame Apache raiders for other crimes, too." She reached into her pouch one final time and produced a list written in Webb's distinctive hand. Even from a distance, Ezra could see names on the paper. "It's a list of people who've been asking too many questions about the missing cattle," Parker read. "Ezra Whitman, Doc Morrison, Father Miguel from the mission." He looked up, his face grim. "This is a kill list," Webb finally broke. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he said, his voice cracking. "It started as just a few head of cattle here and there. Easy money. But then people started noticing, asking questions. So you decided to murder anyone who got too close to the truth," Parker said. "We decided to protect ourselves," Fletcher corrected. "Just like any men would do. Any men would face justice. Not create more victims," Billy Santos said, his young voice filled with disgust. Webb suddenly spun toward his horse, going for the rifle in his saddle scabbard. But Ezra was already moving, tackling the sheriff before he could reach his weapon. They crashed to the ground, fighting for control. Fletcher drew his pistol, but found himself facing Doc Morrison's old Navy Colt. "I may be a healer," Morrison said calmly, "but I fought in the war. Don't test me, son." Billy Santos quickly disarmed Webb while Ezra held him down, and within minutes both men were in handcuffs. "What happens now?" Ayanna asked. Judge Parker folded Crawford's journal carefully. "Now we ensure justice is done. For Crawford. For the Apache people who've been blamed for these crimes. And for everyone else who was put in danger by these men's greed." He looked at Ayanna with something approaching admiration. "Miss, you've shown remarkable courage tonight. Crawford's death won't be in vain." As they prepared to escort the prisoners back to jail, Ezra found himself walking beside Ayanna. "What will you do now?" he asked. She looked toward the eastern mountains where dawn was beginning to touch the peaks with gold. Go home to my people. Tell them the truth about what happened here. Maybe now there can be real peace between our communities. And your brother? He'll testify at the trial. We both will. She paused. What about you, Mr. Whitman? Ezra considered the question. For 3 years he'd been a forgotten man, isolated on his failing ranch, carrying grief like a stone in his chest. But tonight had changed something fundamental in him. I think, he said slowly, it's time I rejoined the living. 6 months later, Ezra Whitman stood in the same canyon where he'd found Ayanna's body. But everything had changed. The red sandstone cliffs looked the same. The sagebrush still dotted the valley floor. But the weight of secrets no longer pressed down on the land like an invisible storm. The trial had been the biggest news Red Canyon Township had seen in decades. Sheriff Webb and Deputy Fletcher were convicted of murder, cattle theft, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges. They were currently serving 20-year sentences in the territorial prison, and Fletcher had agreed to testify about their entire operation in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The stolen cattle had been returned to the Apache reservation, along with substantial compensation from the railroad company, which had claimed ignorance of the theft but still faced federal charges for purchasing stolen government property. Billy Santos had been appointed interim sheriff and was running unopposed in the upcoming election. At 24, he would be the youngest sheriff in Utah Territory history. But his courage during the confrontation had earned him respect throughout the community. Doc Morrison had been officially appointed as the territorial investigator for suspicious deaths, a position that had never existed before but was clearly needed given what they'd uncovered. And Judge Parker had recommended that the territorial governor establish a new position, a liaison between local law enforcement and the Apache reservation to prevent future misunderstandings and ensure justice for all residents of the territory. The person he'd recommended for that position was walking toward Ezra now, across the canyon floor. Ayanna Crow. Feather looked different in her new role, still wearing traditional Apache dress, but now with a silver badge pinned to her vest and a leather portfolio containing official documents under her arm. She'd spent the past month learning territorial law, studying English legal terminology, and building bridges between two communities that had been suspicious of each other for generations. Any trouble with the new fencing? She asked as she approached. None at all. Your brother's crew finished the boundary markers last week. Ezra gestured toward the neat wooden posts that now clearly delineated where reservation land ended and private property began, should prevent any accidental trespassing in either direction. It was more than just practical, it was symbolic. For the first time in the territory's history, the boundaries between Apache and white-owned land were clearly marked and mutually agreed upon. The tribal council is pleased, Ayanna said. No more cattle wandering onto reservation land. No more disputes about property lines, and no more opportunities for men like Webb to exploit the confusion. They walked together toward Ezra's ranch house, which looked considerably better than it had 6 months ago. The roof had been repaired, the barn had been rebuilt, and there were even flowers planted around the front porch, Sarah's favorite petunias, which Ezra had finally found the strength to plant again. Billy stopped by yesterday, Ezra mentioned. Says the railroad is interested in hiring Apache workers for the new line they're building south of here. Honest work for honest wages, Ayanna nodded approvingly. Much better than the old arrangement. They'd reached Ezra's porch where 2 rocking chairs sat side by side, one old and weathered, one newly built. Ezra gestured for Ayanna to sit, then settled into his own chair with a contentment he hadn't felt in years. Got a letter from my son yesterday, he said, pulling the envelope from his shirt pocket. He's coming home from California next month. The gold didn't work out? Oh, he found gold. Made more money than he'd ever dreamed of. Ezra smiled, but he said he realized he'd rather be poor with family than rich and alone. Ayanna studied his face. And how do you feel about that? Grateful, scared, happy. Ezra laughed. I'd forgotten what it was like to feel so many things at once. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set behind the red cliffs. The evening air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark was singing. Ezra, Ayanna said finally, there's something I wanted to ask you. What's that? The tribal council is planning to build a school on the reservation, a place where Apache children can learn both traditional ways and the skills they'll need to deal with the white world. She paused. We're looking for someone to teach practical subjects, mathematics, English, maybe some basic law. Ezra raised an eyebrow. You're asking me to teach? You're asking me to consider it. You're respected by both communities now. The children would listen to you. It was an intriguing possibility. Ezra had always been good with numbers, had handled all the business aspects of ranching for 20 years. And after what they'd been through together, he'd developed a deep respect for Apache culture and wisdom. I'd have to learn more about your people's ways, he said. Wouldn't want to accidentally disrespect anyone. That's exactly why you'd be perfect for the job. A teacher who knows he still has things to learn. Before Ezra could respond, they heard horses approaching. Billy Santos rode into view with Doc Morrison beside him, both men grinning like they had good news to share. Hope we're not interrupting anything important, Billy called out as they dismounted. Just planning the future, Ayanna replied. Doc Morrison climbed onto the porch, moving with more energy than Ezra had seen from him in years. Well, if you're planning the future, you might want to include this in your calculations. He handed Ezra an official-looking document with territorial seals and ribbons. What is it? A commendation from the territorial governor for your courage in exposing corruption and your service to justice. Morrison's eyes twinkled. Also comes with a reward, $500 from the federal government for recovering stolen property. Ezra stared at the document. $500 was more money than his ranch had made in the past 3 years combined. There's more, Billy added. The railroad company wants to hire you as a security consultant. They need someone who knows the territory and can spot trouble before it starts. Me? You proved you can't be bought, can't be intimidated, and won't look the other way when something's wrong, Billy said. That's exactly what they need. Ezra looked at Ayanna, who was smiling broadly. Sounds like you're going to be a busy man. We're going to be busy people, he corrected. All of us. Building something better than what was here before. As the others rode away into the star-filled night, Ezra remained on his porch for a long time, thinking about the young Apache woman who had changed everything by refusing to stay dead, and about the badge that had revealed the truth, and about the courage it had taken for all of them to stand up for what was right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new reasons to keep fighting for justice. But tonight, for the first time in years, Ezra Whitman went to sleep knowing that he was no longer alone in the world. The truth had set them all free.